Okay. Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to our Stone Center for Research on Wealth Inequality and Mobility, our event this evening. Happy to have you. I'm Damon Jones. I am a faculty member here at the Harris School of Public Policy and also an associate director at the Stone Center alongside Stephen Durlauf, our director, and Jeffrey Wackey, and the other associate director. I'd like to thank everyone for coming out. I'd like to thank our extensive team that puts these events together. I see many from the Stone Center. We have our AV team. We have people from the Harris School that work together to bring these events to you. My job tonight is simply just to introduce the next person that you'll hear from. And that is Ethan Bueno de Mesquita, who is the Dean of the Harris School and the Sidney Stein Professor. He is also an associate at the Political Science Department here at the University of Chicago. He's a political scientist, studies political economy, studies topics such as conflict, political violence, national security, and electoral politics. He's published numerous articles in political science and economics journals, and he's a co-author of two books, Political Economy for Public Policy, Theory and Credibility, and Thinking Clearly with Data. Both of those books are books that are helpful here at the Harris School in our teaching and our core classes, and when he wasn't dean, Ethan was also teaching the students in our core and teaching a class called Analytical Politics. And the interesting thing about that course is, among other things, the students and the professors will grapple with issues of fairness, different issues related to political philosophy and fairness. How should we allocate and distribute things here in society? And I think that's also relevant to the topics here tonight when we're going to be talking about meritocracy. Who deserves what and who earns what? And so without further ado, I'll pass it on to Ethan, and he'll introduce the rest of our speakers. And please enjoy the rest of the events. Thanks.
Thanks, Damon. It is great to see so many people here. For the next of our Stone Center conversations. I'm Ethan Bueno de Mesquita. As Damon just told you, I guess. I'm the Dean of the Harris School. It's great to be here. I always look forward to these Stone Center conversations. You know, I spend my days toiling in the meritocratic fields of the deanship, and it is nice to get a chance in the evening to talk about some ideas. So I want to get us started. I feel like these events have become signature events for the Harris School. They are, to me, really a model of what we're trying to do here at the University of Chicago outside of the work we do in the classroom and in our offices and our desks doing research, which is to take up really first-order ideas about the world we live in, about the society we live in the ways in which we want to live our lives, in which the way we think society should be structured, and the ways in which we think there may be problems, and talk about them, argue about them, subject them to serious, rigorous debate in ways that let us play around with new ideas, talk across our differences, see that we disagree on some fundamental things, but also maybe make some progress on coming to agreement. We've, over the course of this series, talked about, I think, some of the most important issues facing American society and the world, and we will continue to do so, and I'm just delighted to get to be a part of it. So without further ado, let me get us started by introducing our two esteemed panelists. So first, the reason we are here today, Daniel Markovits is the Guido Calabresi Professor of Law at the Yale Law School and the founding director of the Center for the Study of Private Law. He's a prolific writer, both of scholarly work across fields, from law to philosophy to economics, as well as a public intellectual writing in a variety of outlets that you all read all the time, from the New York Times to the Washington Post to the Atlantic. We are here to talk about his book, The Meritocracy Trap, which develops, as you'll hear in just a moment, a sustained attack on some of the organizing principles of American society and the way in which we organize our politics, the way we organize our economics, and perhaps most importantly, for me at least, the way we organize our education system. I'm looking forward to having a good discussion about that. He's also at work on a new book, tentatively titled The Good Life After the Age of Growth, which I'm looking forward to arguing with him about in a few years. And we are also joined by my colleague, Stephen Durlauf, who's a faculty member here at the Harris School and the director of the Stone Center for Research on Wealth Inequality and Mobility. Stephen is a distinguished economist who has done obviously important work on inequality, most recently work on wealth mobility, the sources and determinants of wealth mobility in America and beyond. He has done foundational work across the fields of economics, most notably, I think, for being maybe the leading voice in modern economics for bringing in a diversity of disciplinary perspectives onto fundamental economic questions. He has done really important work bringing in ideas from sociology especially, but other fields, into economics by offering formal models of them, by offering ways to bring the most rigorous data analysis to bear on ideas that emerge from outside of economics and folding them into the way we think about the modern economy. He has also been the inspiration for this event, which is his brainchild, and these conversations. So we're just delighted to have Stephen with us, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation. So I am now going to, I believe, invite Daniel up to give us some introductory remarks to get the conversation going. Stephen will then follow, and then we'll have a conversation.
Thanks very much. Thank you. Am I mic'd up? Yes, I am. So thank you for the introduction. Thanks for the invitation. It's just a huge, huge pleasure to be here in this space, which is a great space, and to be talking with you all. And I hope we have a great conversation when I'm done with my 20 minutes and you're done with your 20 minutes. The conversation is the best bit. So why don't I get started? Just by introducing what it is that we have in mind when we talk about meritocracy. And in particular, as opposed to other forms of social and economic ordering, meritocracy allocates advantage based on accomplishment, rather than based on, say, race or gender or class or some other feature of the person. But that's, of course, underspecified because there are lots of different ways of articulating and measuring accomplishment. And in the United States today, we have a market meritocracy. Accomplishment effectively in our civilization is measured by human capital. And human capital is produced in schools, in competitive schools, where schools evaluate human capital based on grades and test scores. And then human capital is deployed in the labor market. Again, a competitive labor market, not necessarily in the economic sense of a perfectly competitive labor market, but in the intuitive sense that your odds of getting a job depends on whether you're more attractive to the employer than the person behind you in the job queue. And so in that sense, a competitive labor market. And human capital is deployed to capture wages in the labor market. Now, meritocracy, so understood, has two core virtues. And it's important to understand that these are genuine virtues. You know, I said I'm delighted to be here at the University of Chicago, which I think of as the great American university. And you know, one of the reasons I'm delighted to be here is because of the virtue of excellence and seriousness of thought and intellect and productivity, and the fact that these virtues are available in some principled sense to all comers, to anybody who's willing and able to participate. And meritocracy has real virtues, and part of the irony of meritocracy is that the vices that I'm going to focus on are not just the flip side of the virtues, they are the virtues. So part of the problem of meritocracy is that it produces, in a systematic sense, very bad outcomes precisely on account of the things that make it so appealing and attractive. So what are they? Well, one thing is it gives everybody a fair shot of getting ahead. That is to say, you aren't excluded in a meritocracy based on your race or your gender or your caste or class in any de jure way. And the sense is that meritocracy opens up an elite. And the second thing that meritocracy does, well, let's just start by saying it was invented in the US in order to do that. Here I'm focusing on my own university and how meritocracy came to Yale. But the idea at the middle of the last century is that the old elite was sclerotic and inbred. And what meritocracy would do is it would open up the elite to outsiders who had previously been excluded by other, let's call them aristocratic forms of social ordering. And meritocracy, to a large degree, did that. The other thing that meritocracy does is it produces a very capable elite. Because if you compete to get ahead, if you compete to get places in competitive and excellent schools, then those who do best will get those places, and the schools will squeeze more training and human capital into their students. And in the labor market, the labor institutions, the work institutions will be organized around sorting and selecting for the most capable people, and the most capable people will get to the top. And in fact, meritocracy worked as planned in its early years in the United States. It dramatically opened up the American elite. In fact, the people in this room are largely consequences of that opening up. If you just look around, and I'm just sort of guessing, if I look at people's gender, if I look at people's race, half of us would not be here but for meritocracy. And in that sense, meritocracy succeeded at producing the open, dynamic elite that it aimed at. Now, one of the reasons that meritocracy was so successful early on is that the old aristocratic elite, if we're being blunt about it, wasn't very hardworking, it wasn't very smart. So when you opened up places in schools and jobs among employers to those who were the most capable, the old aristocrats just lost out. The problem, and now I'm going to twist towards what I think is the central sins of our meritocracy, is that the new elite, the people who got ahead by winning in the last circle of the competition, unlike the old aristocrats, they are very smart. And they're very hardworking. And they have an almost unlimited appetite for training their children and an almost unmatched capacity to do so. And so in future generations of meritocracy's life cycle, the new meritocrats monopolize advantage using the meritocratic system that they won at, often as outsiders initially. And if you look at, for example, schooling here, the national public school average of per pupil expenditures for high school students is roughly $12,000 a year. The Forbes top 20 most elite private schools today, where 80% of the students come from households in the top 5% of the income distribution, spends about $75,000 a year. And notice something really important here. The gap between the rich and the middle class, which is about $60,000, is 15 times bigger than the gap between the middle class and the poor. So one of the things that meritocracy does is it concentrates advantage at the high end in a narrow elite. And this really matters because the traditional social justice programs to reduce gaps between the poor and the middle class don't work politically or even actuarially to reduce the gaps between the rich and the middle class. We can find a way, if we have the right politics, we certainly have the budgets, to spend $12,000 or even $15,000 per child per year on every high school kid in America. But we cannot spend $75,000 per child per year on every high school kid in America. And so that's a structural difference in the problem posed by meritocracy. Now, education works. And differences in investment in children produce massive differences in childhood academic achievement. Here you see in the blue line the 90-50 percentile income achievement gap in the United States and the 50-10 percentile income achievement gap in the United States over the past 70 years or so. And as you can see, the middle class and the poor are either stable or roughly converging. That's partly because that gap between the $12,000 and the $8,000 spent in public schools has actually been shrinking somewhat in response to various kinds of political and legal activism. But the gap between the rich and the middle class has been growing. And the gap between the rich and the middle class is absolutely now very large. The income gap, the rich-poor income gap now actually, is the red line, and the black-white or the white-black gap is the dashed blue line. And what this slide shows is that for high school academic achievement, economic inequality in the United States today is producing a bigger gap in achievement than American apartheid did at mid-century. And notice 1955 is the year Brown v. Board of Education was decided. So economic inequality, again, is producing a bigger gap between the rich and the poor in childhood academic achievement than apartheid did in 1955. That's the size of the gap. And again, the biggest gap is between the rich and the middle class. A typical child from a household whose parents earn over $200,000 a year, that's again roughly the top 5% of the income distribution or so, will score 250 points higher on the SAT than a median income household child, even as the medium income household child scores only about 125 points higher than a child at or below the poverty line. So the rich middle class gap is twice as big as the middle class poor gap, and that's a direct consequence of this enormous appetite and capacity that rich and well-educated parents have for squeezing training, squeezing human capital into their children. This produces an incredibly skewed elite. This is the odds of going to college in America today by your parents' income rank. And it's hard to imagine anything more skewed than this, except this, which is the quality of the college you go to based on your parents' income rank. And at the most elite colleges, this is the 150 or so most competitive colleges in America, the top quartile of the income distribution is overrepresented compared to the bottom quartile by a factor of about 14 to 1. Now, that's not surprising. There's never been a society in which elite institutions have welcomed the poor. But the top quartile is also overrepresented compared to each of the middle two quartiles by a factor of about 6 to 1. So the rich are squeezing out not just the poor, but also the middle class. And at the most elite institutions, at the Ivy Plus schools, you've probably all seen this observed before, there have in recent years been more kids from the top 1% of the distribution than from the entire bottom half. And if you try to get even more spiky fine in your pointed eliteness, at Yale, Harvard, Princeton, and Stanford, there are more kids from the top 1% than from the bottom 60%. And again, this phenomenon cannot be corrected for by traditional economic egalitarian means. So schools have, in the past few years, particularly elite universities, devoted a lot of energy to increasing the share or the number of students that they admit who come from real economic disadvantage, to increasing their Pell Grant recipient shares from, sometimes from 14% to 18%. So a material increase, but from a very low base. But they have not thereby decreased the share of their student bodies who come from real privilege. Instead, what they've done is they've squeezed out the middle class. And if you want to understand a significant part of why elite universities have such a bad reputation in the broader population of the United States today, and I'll come back to that right at the end of my remarks, it's significantly because the middle class views elite universities as a conspiracy between the rich and the poor and against them. And if you look at the data, there's a sense in which the middle class is not wrong. They're not wrong about that, and that's part of the structural problem that these universities face. Now, here's a way to think about it. Imagine that you were to take the child of a typical 1% family, and in each year of that child's life, you would put the difference between what is spent on their education and what's spent on a typical middle-class kid's education, not a poor kid's, a middle-class kid's education, and put that into a trust fund to invest it in the S&P 500 to be given to the rich child on the death of its parents. Now, the reason I calculate this hypothetical is that that's how the old aristocratic elite used to pass its privilege down through its generations. The parents would accumulate physical or financial capital, and they'd die and give it to the children. Well, this amount for the meritocrats today would be a meritocratic inheritance of between $10 and $15 million per child. And that's the extent to which this kind of concentrated super elite schooling passes privilege dynastically down through the generations of elite families. Now, what do the people do when they finish these schools? Well, they go to work. And they go to work in very particular jobs. And strikingly, their work and their labor is the source of their economic privilege, their income and wealth in their generations. So rising economic inequality in the United States today is principally caused, actually, not by a shift of income away from labor and towards capital. That shift is real, but it accounts for, at most, a quarter of the total increase of the 1%'s share of total national income. It is mostly caused by a shift within the labor part of the income distribution, away from mid-skilled and in favor of super-skilled labor. And if you want to know who's in the 1%, you can actually not do academic economics, you can just do journalism, and just start looking at who has these jobs. So these are all jobs that you overwhelmingly have to have gone to a fancy university to get, and they pay enough that if you're in them, you'll be in the 1%. And the people who have those jobs, finance sector professionals, executives at big firms, elite management consultants, partners at the right law firms, and specialist medical doctors, together make up over half of the 1%. These are the working rich. superordinate workers, as I sometimes call them, not capitalists. Moreover, they owe today roughly 3/4 of their income to their labor. It used to be if you wanted to know how poor someone was, you asked how much of their income they owe to labor and how long and hard they work. Today, if you want to know how rich someone is, you ask what share of their income they owe to labor and how long and hard they work. And that's a transformation in the past 50 years. Why has it happened? Well, it's happened partly because the technology of production has changed, so that people who work side by side in the same industry and in the same office have become massively differentially productive and massively differentially paid. And the skews of these super skilled on the left, mid-skilled on the right workers working side by side have gone from a situation in which the super skilled worker makes more than the mid-skilled worker, but in some sense lives in the same socioeconomic universe, to a world in which the super skilled worker is making 1,000 times what the mid-skilled worker is making and lives a completely different form of economic, material, and social life. At the same time, what's happened in our labor market is that the bottom has fallen out of the middle of the distribution. There has been a rapid growth in jobs available to people with elite educations, and there's actually been some growth in jobs available to people with very little formal education at all, partly because that's the service sector that serves the household needs of the super rich. And there's been a collapse in mid-skilled jobs. Jobs like travel agents, pharmacists. We can name what the jobs are, and it's going to keep going. And one fascinating thing that's happening with generative AI is that the taking of the jobs is moving up the skill distribution and moving up the socioeconomic status distribution. So you're starting to see white-collar workers are being threatened by being replaced by technology. And it's fascinating, although chilling, sociopolitically, what happens when that phenomenon catches up with people who have that kind of cultural power. The Hollywood writers' strike is an example, and actually elite labor won, in part. And so maybe that's a source of some hope. In addition, the rich now work longer than the rest. And the reason why they work longer than the rest is that the labor market no longer provides enough work for mid-skilled workers to do. But elite workers have become so incredibly productive that the marginal product of an hour for them is so high that they in some sense can't afford not to work. And so the jobs are structured to squeeze labor hours out of, in this case, the 1%, who are relatively to the bottom 60% working 10 to 12 hours a week more now than they did at the middle of the last century. This undermines equality of opportunity because you have a cycle in which rich parents pay for elaborate educations for the rich children. The rich children then get jobs based on that education, and you have a closed loop. And if you look at law firms, for example, half the partners at the 5 most profitable law firms graduated from top 10 schools, and at the single most profitable law firm, 4/5 graduated from a top 5 school. And this is incredible. Every time I give a talk or write an article about this, I'm astonished that this could possibly be true, but roughly half of the American elite across a series of different industries attended just 12 universities. Just 7.3% of workers without a high school degree will earn more than the median college graduate, and just 1.3% of high school only educated workers will earn more than the median professional school graduate. So in some sense, meritocracy, which was embraced as an engine of equality of opportunity, has now become the central structural obstacle to equality of opportunity in American life today. It also has meant intergenerationally that the opportunity to be better off than your parents is disappearing. As you can see, the odds of being richer than your parents for people born in 1980 as opposed to 1940 are dramatically down throughout the distribution, but the drop-off is the biggest, this is the green line, between the 20th and the 80th percentile. So the broad middle class has had the biggest decline in its chance of being richer than its parents. And that's a direct consequence of this loop mechanism that I've been describing. All right, to close off, how should we think about this? Well, here's a familiar puzzle in economics. There are societies that are rich in natural resources, in gold or oil or diamonds, and they turn out to be extremely poor and unstable. Democratic Republic of Congo has GDP per capita of about $550. And then there are other societies that have few or even no natural resources, but they've become rich and stable. This is Singapore, GDP per capita over $60,000. Singapore is, I think, the only country in the world to have achieved its independence by expulsion. That's how poor in natural resources it was at the moment of its independence. And there are lots of reasons for this. For example, colonization and colonial extraction did a great and intergenerational and world historical wrong and harm to people in Congo. But it's also the case that Singapore was colonized, so that's not the whole story. And one story that economists talk about to explain this pattern is what they call the resource curse, which is that resource-rich countries focus on extractive industries, drilling, mining, and so on. And what that does is it concentrates wealth in the landowners. It requires a large class of oppressed workers, and it discourages investment in the middle class, in broad-based middle-class education, and in the institutions that allow the middle class to have political power and independence. And the result is corruption, authoritarianism, and slow growth and political instability. Well, the phenomenon that I've just described is a new version of the resource curse, which the US has invented, in which the cursed resource is not oil, gold, or diamonds, but rather human capital. And what I've just described is a phenomenon in which the labor market concentrates work, concentrates income and status in a narrow class of super-educated, superordinate workers. These workers then dominate an underemployed and disempowered mass of middle-class workers. They use their power to buy schooling for their children that no one else can afford, and those schools then monopolize the elite labor market in the next generation. And so the cycle continues. Social and economic stratification follow, undemocratic politics, corruption, I think it's not too strong a word to say, hatred of elite universities in large segments of the American population naturally follows from this, just as in countries that are cursed by oil or gold or mineral wealth. Meritocratic inequality casts a human resource curse. Now, there's a dark prognosis here, which is that in all of human experience, if you look at Jeffrey Winters' book, Oligarchy, across all of space and time, there are only one, maybe 1.5 societies that have managed to unwind economic and social concentration of privilege in as small an elite as the United States has produced today, peacefully. That is to say, without succumbing to a loss in a war against a foreign enemy or an internal revolution. And the ray of hope is that that society was the United States in 1929. Thank you very much.
So Daniel, thank you for that really brilliant presentation. So as is evident, meritocracy is often something that's more derided than admired in American society. My reason for inviting Daniel is he's made the most powerful case against meritocracy that I'm aware of. And so what I want to do in my remarks is to give you an affirmative case for meritocracy. I don't claim it's the affirmative case, nor do I claim that that this is a debate, it's a conversation. And so what I want to do is construct what I think is an affirmative way to think about meritocracy as a social goal. So in order to do that, I really need to take 4 steps. Number 1, I have to deal with definitions. What do we mean by meritocracy? Number 2, I want to put some ethical considerations on the table. I then want to give what I consider to be a definition of meritocracy that is defensible, and I'm going to call this prospective or social meritocracy, and that's the sense in which there actually isn't going to be a clash in much of what we have to say, because I'm going to change the term of the debate, but I think that it does so in a way that preserves an idea of meritocracy that's useful. And finally, I want to say something about equality efficiency trade-offs, which after all is the nexus of much of the criticism of, or the way in which meritocracy is used in policy contexts. So with respect to definitional challenges, Amartya Sen actually wrote about these in a book in 2000 on meritocracy, which I co-edited. And he made an important point, which is that defenders of meritocracy don't typically defend it. In other words, they have to define it, excuse me. And that it's essential to define what we mean by meritocracy. And so his argument, which I adhere to, is that number 1, we have to say meritocracy with respect to what characteristics of individuals. After all, I could have an argument about moral merit as the basis for allocating things. And second, we have to define the specific context in which we're going to work. In other words, I may think about meritocracy one way if I'm allocating medals in the Olympics. I would think about them very differently if I'm thinking about the allocation of who gets to go to what university. And so, with that in mind, I want to put the following ideas on the table. First, my context. I'm going to really be talking about admissions to universities. Everything I say will apply with equal logic to classroom tracking, which is another example. And also the ideas will have something to do with hiring. All of them mean that my focus here is going to be on an idea that meritocracy says something about the way that we assign people. In other words, some process of matching students to universities, students to classrooms, workers to firms, etc. And so that'll be concrete enough, I hope, to give some meat to the ideas that I want to put on the table. So what are going to be the ethical arguments that I would want to use if I was going to defend meritocracy? I think they come in 4 flavors, and there'll be an overlap with Daniel's. The first is the idea that people do deserve things, and so the notion that desert is a meaningful concept. That's somewhat controversial in philosophy, and in fact, John Rawls completely rejected it. The reason for that is that Rawls would argue, and others, that it is something that is conditional on how a society is organized. In other words, there aren't these deep abstract principles that necessarily lead to desert. I accept all of that. However, desert can mean something else. In other words, in the society we're working on, and once we have a certain set of institutions, then I think that we can have ethical justifications for desert. After all, the Rawls argument would be, I can't say that somebody deserves the Olympic gold medal in the 100-meter dash unless I give you a justification for having a race called the 100 meters at the Olympics. And so I'm going to condition on many aspects of society. And once we do that, I think it's straightforward to make an affirmative case that people deserve something based on what they're going to bring to the table, et cetera. So that's going to be the first idea. The second idea is the productivity idea. It has to do with thinking about, we have social objectives in societies, and the way that we match people to universities, we match people to firms, et cetera, are going to have consequences. They're going to have consequences in terms of what is produced. They're going to have consequences in the distribution of human capital. They're going to have consequences for the incentives that people face. And a key argument I'm going to make is that we can have excess meritocracy, and that's really where the adverse incentives are generated. But what I'm going to, again, in my definition of meritocracy, claim that we can deal with efficiency issues a certain way. The third justification had to do with the notion that there's something about autonomy restricting individuals as individuals and wanting individuals to fulfill their potential that is associated with meritocracy. We think it is a good society, in other words, in which W.E.B. Du Bois did go to Harvard, or in which we think of people of unusual gifts having opportunities. And so those are things we want to respect in the way that we think about the decisions that are made in terms of who does what. And then the final point, and those are really my 3 points, and I want to ultimately distinguish. I gave you the Olympic gold medal example. A very different question is, who should have been members of the Manhattan Project? Now, whatever you think about the ethics of what they produced, there was a well-defined question. Why do I distinguish the two? The second is completely prospective. It was irrelevant what people had done in the past. It was simply asking, what are they going to do? And then here's a harder question. Who should go to Juilliard? In other words, if I'm trying to maximize the quality of music intertemporally, what should be the decision rules by which students are admitted, et cetera? And I'm going to claim those are actually very different questions. So in all of this, I want to be clear on 2 things. Number one, there were other ethical considerations. In other words, I don't claim some unitary vision that meritocracy is a good society. It is a component of a good society, and that's why the philosopher David Miller, who's an advocate of meritocratic, or at least desert as an objective, has wrote a paper called 2 Cheers for Meritocracy and not 3. Second point is that meritocratic assignment rules underdetermine socioeconomic outcomes. To say that I think that the person who's most qualified for a job at this firm has a claim for it, they deserve it, doesn't tell you how much they should be paid. Nor is it the case that it tells you anything about what the nature of the institutions are. In other words, to say I think people deserve to go to the University of Chicago or to Yale, et cetera, doesn't tell you anything about how big the entering classes should be, things like that. So there's going to be many dimensions that are underdetermined, and I think that's important, and that's really where, ultimately our policy beliefs are very similar, even though we sort of articulated things somewhat differently. Now, In defining meritocracy, and this is really the heart of what I want to say, I think there's a conventional definition that is inadequate, and it's what I'm going to call the retrospective definition. And it conceptualizes meritocracy as desert or conditional on past accomplishment. And so what's the typical, the default idea in debates on college admissions is that somehow the default should be test scores and grades. Whoever has higher ones has a greater claim to a position at a university than somebody else. My view of that is that's actually the wrong way to think about meritocracy, and in fact, it's flawed. And so I put that on the table, not because I'm going to defend it, I'm going to criticize it, but rather because I think that is the way that most conventional conversations start. My claim is that it is better to think about these things in terms of prospective meritocracy. And so I'm going to be an economist, but I'm going to think about the social planner rather than what markets do in a decentralized fashion. And my definition of meritocracy is an assignment rule that says that relative to some social objective, this assignment rule best meets the social objective. Now, what are going to be key features here? Number one, in a tautological sense, I'm going to equate meritocracy with meritocratic outcomes with more efficient ones, but of course I got to tell you what my objectives are in terms of being efficient. But the second thing is everything is going to be thought about prospectively and dynamically. So why do I make a big deal about that? Think about the idea that I have affirmative action in college admissions. That has consequences not just at one point in time, it has it everywhere. In other words, the admissions rules for universities determine the incentives for hard work, for effort of students that go to lower quality schools. And there's very strong evidence that if one of the consequences of implementing affirmative action policies was in the state of Texas, was that test scores went up in high school students for those that were potentially eligible. That's the incentive issue. You have to create opportunities for people and create incentives for the goods that we think of in society in terms of maximizing potential. The second idea is we can never think about the decisions as individuals in isolation. The students of today are the role models of tomorrow. They're the communicators of information through social networks. And so once one has this holistic view of the social objective, then you have very different ways to think about these problems. So let me talk about this in a little bit more detail, and there's some examples in the literature. So David Miller would argue the reason that the most qualified person deserves the job is because the objective of the firm is to make as much as possible. My argument has been that, in fact, static meritocratic rules could be dynamically inefficient, and therefore prospective meritocratic rules have many more implications that are associated with what we think of as egalitarian outcomes. So, whoops, did I go the wrong way? Here are the examples that I focus on. Just a couple of examples to think about. There is very strong evidence that exposure to a single black teacher has strong effects on the educational outcomes of black children. Another example is that African American doctors treat their black patients differently, and it seems that the health outcomes are improved. Now, without taking a stance on the details or nuances of the studies, I mean these as fundamental examples of the answer to the question, who deserves to be admitted to an educational program or to a college? You have to ask what they're going to do in society. Those are socially determined. They aren't mechanical rewards for having had a certain SAT score. Now, this is where I want to put the economist hat on and say, this is in fact how economic theory, I think correctly articulated, would give us the notion of meritocracy. I would start with the social objective. I have populations of people, and incentives, mechanisms, institutions are set in place. We want to ask questions as they evolve across time. What sort of assignment rules are going to maximize social objectives? One social objective can be egalitarian. I want some equality of outcomes. Another can be equality of opportunity. They don't go together. I'm going to argue that, in fact, the conflicts between them are often overblown, but those are the cases there. And so in each case, when we're asking questions about who should be admitted to this college, who should be tracked into this classroom, et cetera, who should be hired by this firm, we can't talk about it in isolation. And in fact, I think that one of the major sources of inequality in the United States is excess segregation, economic, racial, educational, et cetera, but that is it is excess because it's actually socially inefficient, and so it is not meritocratic by my definitions. So here's a very simple example. Let me go back to this. Suppose I had a set of students and I was deciding who to put in one classroom, and I'm not an egalitarian. All I want to do is maximize their skill level, the average skill level at the end of the year. That's a classic problem in economics. It's called the Becker marriage model, because he had to talking about marriages there. But it had a very simple answer. And that is there was a certain condition, basically, on the interactions between people called complementarity, that if I wanted to maximize the average, I would sort the students by the skills they have at the beginning of the school year. It turns out that that is a classical equality efficiency trade-off, because the thing that maximizes the average also maximizes the inequality. It is also a completely unnatural question. What do I mean by that? Again, suppose that I'm interested in maximizing the average human capital in graduating seniors in a high school. What do I do about kindergartners? Assume all of the Becker conditions and complementarity are there. It turns out the answer is much more complicated. The way that we should think about students, their assignments to classrooms, their assignments to universities ultimately, is that we may have some end goals, but rather what we want to do is shape the distribution of skills at every point in the way so that at the time we have the end goals, it's the best distribution with which to work. And so if you go through the classroom tracking example, you can have situations where you would never track kindergartners, you would never track first graders, because you have to avoid students basically getting lost and going on trajectories of very low skill levels so that when they're seniors, they're not going to be very productive. Now, the devil's all in the mathematical details there, and this is not the right forum to say, oh, yes, how you write it, et cetera. But the point I want you to see is that once you think about societies that have objectives in terms of producing excellent outcomes, be it in the arts, be it in science, et cetera, all of those have to be represented as the outcomes of a very complicated dynamic process. And to say that I deserve something has to say that I am meeting the social goal. To say that to characterize somebody's merit is to ask what are they contributing to that goal. And that is all to me fundamental. Now let me make a few comments about empirics. First comment I want to make is that with reference to elite universities, there's very good evidence that having higher test scores, academic achievement, does mean that the students do better in school. In other words, they have more achievements in terms of what they're learning in the schools. So in that sense, if I said to you I want to sort of match students that have high test scores to the elite institutions, I think it's going to produce something. Yes, the evidence is there. However, notice that the studies that do that also tell us something else. And that is they tell us that universities, the elite ones, are doing a relatively poor job of identifying talented students. In other words, much of the disparities in terms of the outcomes of students from the Chetty work is that the elite institutions are simply not matching to the students that have the greatest potential. So for me, that's not a failure of merit, that's actually a failure of implementing meritocracy. And I think there's pretty good evidence that this is a significant factor. That's the first point I want to make. Second point I want to make is it's fine for me to talk about social efficiency, but they have actually relatively little evidence on many of the reasons that are given to claim that static meritocracy is efficient. This notion that somehow you have to match these types of people to this firm because today it'll be most productive, et cetera. It is extraordinarily difficult to actually come up with credible empirical evidence of these things. If I asked you, how would I make a claim that there's a complementarity between a given student's SAT and the average SAT of the other students? If you carefully study the literature, it's essentially done by assumption. They write down a functional form, analyze the data, it had to have it there. And so I want to be clear that even though I'm making an argument, there is evidence of these. To make a good argument, one has to be extraordinarily careful, and one wants to recognize the limits to the knowledge that we have. One good example of this is on classroom tracking, where the survey is a little long in the tooth, but not that long, where Julian Betts said, we've been studying this for decades and we don't actually know what the effect is. Now, that is not meant to create nihilism, or skepticism, I should say. Rather, what it says is you have to do these things extremely carefully. And so Guanglei Hong and Stephen Raudenbush, both associated with the Stone Center, sociologists, have shown in very detailed studies of classrooms the ways in which sometimes tracking will be efficient. And by the way, it can be efficient for everybody. In other words, that the sorting can have positive consequences because it allows the teachers to tailor what they're doing. But again, this is all going to be, you have to do it in specific contexts. And so a repeated message of what I have to say is that meritocracy, prospectively, requires very complicated decision rules, not the simplistic reward test scores and grades, which is commonplace, but rather means you have to talk about the context. Third thing I want to do is I want to say something about equality efficiency trade-offs or equity efficiency trade-offs. The first comment is to say that they are often illusory. And in fact, I have a lovely quotation from Adam Smith who in the theory of moral sentiments, actually, I claimed he's Adam Smith, the meritocrat. His deep objection he had to British society in the late 18th century was it was not meritocratic. In other words, that there were incentives for excellence among the less advantaged, but the rich were essentially a self-reproducing elite, but it was the old type of elite. In other words, it was rewarding being a good courtier, etc. And so this point I want to make more generally is that meritocratic ideas, as Daniel put on the table, they were historically egalitarian ideas. Because the vision of the societies that they were working against was ones in which the accident of birth and being in a certain hereditary class, et cetera, was determining outcomes as opposed to one's ability. And so you see a stream of thinking throughout the political theory, political philosophy of that time that is always equating the two. Now, the interesting change that occurs is actually, in my judgment, around John Stuart Mill, who began to realize that the elimination of these hereditary barriers, et cetera, something that went wrong. In other words, the rise of a relatively meritocratic Victorian England was not associated with profound equality of opportunities and had horrendous inequalities. That, of course, is then taken by Marx into developing different visions of what a good society is going to require. In other words, the pure meritocracy with relatively unregulated market mechanisms, not to mention the correctly pointed out ability of the affluent to manipulate or to affect political outcomes, that created what I, in my own work, would call distributional instabilities. And so what I want on the table, in other words, is to say that we could think about meritocracy, but recognize exactly what is going on here. In other words, that unregulated meritocratic outcomes may become non-meritocratic in my parlance because of the fact that you have opportunity hoarding or the lack of attention to the dynamic consequences of allocations, assignment rules, et cetera. And that, to me, is the fundamental point I want to make, which is that that's the meritocracy that I think that I'm trying to defend. Now, again, in thinking about examples of all this, the Civil Service Act, in which you required examinations rather than being a member of the right political party, that's a meritocratic outcome, fundamentally one that's egalitarian. There's a remarkable study that was done asking if you were to eliminate, you ask what percentage of economic growth after the diminution of injustices in labor occupations that was done against African Americans and women could you attribute to that diminution? It was something on the order of 20% of the economic growth that occurred. And so these are all the examples in which meritocracy is both growth enhancing and equality enhancing. Interestingly, this was literally tweeted today. And that is, if you look at Nobel Prize winners and family background, there's a disturbing association with them, but the country that's the outlier in terms of having the weakest association is the United States. And I think that says something positive about the nature of the meritocracy here compared to other countries. Remarkably, this paper concluded it was less associated than it was in the Soviet Union. I haven't studied the paper, so I'm surprised by it, but I want you to have this on the table. And that's the point I want to emphasize. And what they also found was Nobel laureates much more associated with communities that had high intergenerational mobility. So all of that comes down to the following things I want to say. First of all, margins matter. All these claims about whether or not meritocracy is somehow giving something to, is denying dessert, that depends on what the margin is. It's not the comparison of the average of some ultimate 1%. It's asking about the marginal admissions, et cetera, and those tend to be small. The second point is that anything that we say, meritocracy is compatible with thinking about egalitarian adjustments. And so if I said to you, if the university's objective is to produce Nobel Prize winners and Fields medalists, it's very pretentious, that doesn't tell us much about the admissions policy. It maybe says that there's 50 people that you want to admit. That's a meritocratic objective. And so once you think about the multiplicity of outcomes, there's plenty of room for the hardcore meritocratic as well as a more social notion of meritocratic. All of those are compatible with that, and that's because margins matter. These are the policy outcomes I really want to put on the table. That number one, that we really focus on maximizing each individual's potential, level up rather than level down, emphasize on extremely strong regulation of public educational systems to equalize things, et cetera. And the second, again, is to minimize the role of bottlenecks in society. In other words, there's no reason that the University of Chicago has to have a certain number of students, so on and so forth. Interestingly enough, since several Nobel laureates went to Berkeley this week, the chancellor tweeted the following. He pointed out that Berkeley has 33,000 undergraduates. That's very different than Chicago that has 7,800. If you look at the number of Pell Grant recipients in the Ivy League, about the same as Berkeley. All of that's to say is that I think that the meritocracy that is worth defending is one, let me go to the last slide since I'm out of time, is consistent with another famous thinker. If I say to you, what does it mean to say, to each according to his ability, from each according to his need? One side was meritocratic, and Marx himself, and I actually, this is controversial, I don't think he was actually interested in inequality of outcomes. And that's a consensus among many thinkers. The serious points are following. He wanted to maximize potential and thought capitalism was diminishing the potentials of individuals. And so my vision, for better or worse, is that that should be the objective. One component of it is is this prospective notion of meritocracy, and I think the best ways to improve it are to avoid excess avoid the abuse of static meritocratic notions, and to do everything possible to level up and expand the bottlenecks. So let me stop there. Thank you.
All right, thank you both. Okay, so I want to start the conversation, I guess, going back to some normative questions, but I want to start, I guess, pre-start, actually, by thinking about definitions just for a moment, because for all of his considerable merits, Stephen cheated. He admitted he was going to cheat at the beginning, but he did cheat, and he changed the definition of meritocracy on us. And so I just want to put out for you what I think are two slightly unfair, but maybe clarifying definitions of meritocracy that I think map not perfectly, but close enough, let's say, to I think each of the versions of meritocracy the two of you suggested in a half a phrase. So for Stephen, I guess meritocracy is something like assigning people to opportunities and or life outcomes based on their potential to contribute to social goals, whatever those social goals may be. And that's an unusual definition of meritocracy. I can see the point that, like, there's some merit to being able to contribute to social goals. It doesn't mean, I think, the kind of plain meaning that we usually use, which I think is the one that Daniel started us with, which is something like assigning people to life outcomes based on their demonstrated ability to achieve outcomes. Where those outcomes, I think, are typically institution-specific as opposed to social. So that is to say, meritocracy with respect to getting into medical school or becoming a doctor has to do with demonstrated ability to achieve medical outcomes. And meritocracy with respect to finance has to do with demonstrated ability to achieve money-making outcomes. And meritocracy with respect to Juilliard has to do with demonstrated ability with respect to playing the violin. I'm going to stick with something like that definition for now, and that, of course, entails all sorts of things about demonstrated capacity as well as the ability, the capacity for hard work and all the rest of it, which I think sets in cycle all the stuff that's doing the work in Daniel's argument. So I just put that definitional point out there, and then I want to start with a normative question, in part because I want to try and pin you down a little bit on exactly what aspects of meritocracy you're most troubled by. So I see two strains of argument in the book, and one of them came a little bit more to the fore in your presentation, and maybe that's the answer to my question, but I want to start here and just get a sense of it. So, and I'm going to come back to Marx, too, so it's good. You come to the University of Chicago to hear that meritocracy is no good and that we should be thinking about Marx. So one of the arguments I see, and the one that got less attention in your comments, is this I would say kind of neo-Marxist argument that has to do with oppression and exploitation, where the argument is something like meritocracy along the lines I defined it, which is the demonstrated ability, which entails all the stuff with the hard work and the constant striving. This is an argument that I think has echoes of, say, an argument we would hear from neo-Marxists like J.A. Cohen about capitalism, that, like, fundamentally the system which commodifies labor, et cetera, is just debasing to human life. It is also an argument that we might hear, maybe to put it in less friendly company, from, say, conservative communitarians like Patrick Keneen or Adrian Vermeule, that again, the kind of system, what they would refer to not as capitalism or as meritocracy, but as liberalism, kind of creates a systemic system in which is not fit for proper human living. And I think your argument at times runs along the lines of the problem with meritocracy is because it creates both this hollowing out of the middle class and this sense of unempowerment and exploitation, or sorry, oppression, and because it creates this constant need for striving for the elites to stay the elite, to make sure they're all this anxiety to keep their kids in the elite, et cetera, that meritocracy is fundamentally not fit for human life, that is debasing to us, that it's not the way we should be living. That's one kind of argument I hear. And the other kind of argument I hear, which is a pretty radical kind of argument, not to say wrong, but more socially radical. The other kind of argument I hear, and the one that I think you focused on, and in some ways Stephen focused on as well, is a more familiar argument about the problem of inequality of outcomes leading to inequality of opportunity.
Exactly.
And that meritocracy, just inevitably because of skill-biased returns, et cetera, leads to all sorts of inequalities in economic outcomes, which lead to inequalities in political and educational outcomes, or whatever, and that fundamentally that is incompatible with inequality of with equality of opportunity, not for like deep sociological reasons, but just because of like the raw economic facts of the way power works. And so I guess in some sense my question is the problem really meritocracy along the lines of the more radical kind of neo-Marxist critique, or is it the absence of meritocracy in the sense that meritocracy sows the seeds of its own destruction because it undermines equality of opportunity, and what we should really care about is equality of opportunity. I'm just interested in which of these.
Yeah. So are the ground rules that I say something now?
Yeah, there are no ground rules, but yes, you should say something.
I'm happy to say something. So that's great. That was great too, and I want us to engage particularly about this question about what the desideratum is. So on your two questions, I'll start with the second one, and then I'll say something about the first, the more radical one, because I think that gets closer to some of the things that are at issue in between our views. Look, I think there are two ways to think about it. One of them is there's good reason to believe that when inequality of outcome gets big enough, equality of opportunity becomes impossible. And that's not a contingent property of one or another social and economic order. It's connected to the way in which each generation uses its outcomes to privilege its children. And that's connected to why I think that it's not the case that the solution is more meritocracy, because there's a slight elision in the way in which you formulated the intergenerational story, which is that if we're going to allocate advantage based on accomplishment, there are actually three inputs into accomplishment. Something like natural talent, something like effort, and then training. And if it turns out, which I believe, although this is probably an article of faith in me rather than something that I could win over a skeptic about, that training is the biggest determinant. In other words, on the nature-nurture question, I'm a nurture person. Then it's going to turn out that because parents can advantage their children through training, inequalities of outcomes are going to generate inequalities of opportunity through the meritocratic mechanism. Right? If it turned out that training didn't work, then it might be that inequalities of outcome would generate inequalities of opportunity through non-meritocratic mechanisms. That's called the old aristocracy. But my view is that because training works and because training is such an incredibly important input into accomplishment, inequalities of outcomes generate inequalities of opportunity through the meritocratic mechanism. And that's why this, in some sense, relatively conventional observation turns its critical edge into meritocracy more than others who also worry about outcomes and opportunities would agree with. And a lot turns on this belief that I have that training really works, and it's one of the biggest inputs into accomplishment. And if people are interested, I can explain later why I believe that to be true, but let me just say that my experience about the nurture-nature debate is that there are very strong reasons in favor of each of the poles of that debate, and I have never known anyone to change their mind in response to argument. Even good faith people, it's just this seems to me to be as close to a sort of foundational view of the human condition as I've come across. On the second, or the first point really, the more radical point, and this is where I think we're really in conversation. Look, a lot turns on what counts as accomplishment. And on the most open-ended and generic, but also generous conception of accomplishment, whereas accomplishment is something that is all things considered worthwhile. And what meritocracy does is it allocates people to positions in the pursuit of global accomplishment. It's going to be hard to object to lots of features of meritocracy. But every actual meritocracy has a narrower conception of what counts as accomplishment. So, in the Chinese meritocracy, in the Qing dynasty, it was a certain kind of scholarly learning. In the Mongol meritocracy, it was a certain kind of military capacity. In ours, it is very much connected to the ability to have a high marginal product on the labor market. And a significant part of what I'm objecting to is treating the ability to have a high marginal product on the labor market as the thing that counts as accomplishment. Partly because that's what drives this intergenerational story I was talking about earlier, but partly also because that turns out, I think, to produce very bad human outcomes that make a society that's not fit for human living in at least two ways. The first is it gives people incentives to, in a very competitive, meritocratic, and just intuitively accomplishment-full way, to promote behaviors and technologies that have a very high private marginal product and a low or negative social product. I teach in a law school. Elite U.S. American legal scholarship and practice is the most dynamic, innovative, and meritocratic in the world, but it's also almost certainly true that all the innovation in U.S. American law schools has had a negative social product for the United States of America. It's created the market for corporate control. It's created the deregulatory movements in the state. It's created a series of technologies that enable capital to immiserate and exploit labor. And it's done so by being creative, dynamic, energetic in circumstances in which the private returns to having a certain set of skills are very, very high, even as the social product of applying those skills is zero or negative. And so that's one part of the problem. It's also the case that this system, and this is something that you were also gesturing at that I did not talk about much in my initial remarks, it does mean that even the elite worker is an exploited and alienated worker. And the sort of most classical Marxist part of my view is that I'm telling a story about alienated and exploited labor. It's just that because the alienated and exploited human capitalist is the owner of their own human capital, they benefit, they're the beneficiaries of their own exploitation. So they're rich, they're wealthy, but they're not well. Last thought, and then this is where I think there's a real challenge for your redefinition of merit. And this is why I think both the left, Marx, and the communitarian right see this problem with the sort of bourgeois, property-owning, democratic, liberal middle, which is that for all of its vices, one thing this market system does is it provides a commensurating language of value that we can use in order to order our lives more or less peaceably with one another, even as we disagree fundamentally about what human flourishing consists in. And that's what the price system achieves. It achieves a way of saying what something is worth based on what everybody else has to give up in order for me to own it, as measured by a formally equal amalgamation of all their preferences. And so we can decide, Marx called prices the wooing glances cast at money by commodities, because he didn't believe you could have an intelligible conception of value that wasn't rooted in a fundamental truth about value. But what the price system does is it creates a commensurating frame of value that does not have to be rooted in a fundamental moral truth about value. And in an open pluralist society, that turns out to be kind of a big deal. And part of the problem that a view like yours is going to confront, and also I should say a view like the one I'm developing in the book I'm working on now is going to have to confront, is what replaces price as the public frame of value without becoming tyrannical and oppressive. Because I know what's good for people, and you know what's good for people, and all of you know what's good for people, and we disagree. And in the absence of price, we're going to need a mechanism for deciding which one of our conceptions of value dominates all the others. And we don't have a great deal of success as a human society in developing that kind of a mechanism without a lot of oppression. And I think that's the really deep challenge that's in the back of your question, which is you can see why it's the anti-democrats on both sides who are glomming on to this true critique of what it is that we're doing, but the alternatives they're offering don't seem that palatable, at least to me.
Not sure where to start. So let me say several things. First of all, in thinking about meritocracy, I emphasize the perspective one for two reasons. First of all, because I think most of the justifications that are given only make sense, conventional ones, when it's perspective. In other words, the idea that I deserve to have a job because I'm going to be productive, it's an organization, it's evolving across time. The claim that I should be at a university has to be perspective. It's in terms of what I'm going to do and contribute at the university and afterwards. So that's the first point. The second point I would say is that some of the justifications I do think are more conventional. In other words, the notions of desert transcend the social definition was trying to broaden what it means to deserve, but the notion of desert, I think, is itself a defensible idea. And similarly, the idea that we put a value in societies both on people fulfilling their potential, even that it induces differences in the potentials. That's something I think is meritocratic and is defensible. So in that sense, I put them all as different justifications. But I fully, as I said, how I taught my children to play games. I say cheat because you want to win. Okay. But the serious point is, I think part of what I wanted to say in doing this is the following, and that is, Americans believe in meritocracy. That is not going to change. And I think it's been a mistake of egalitarians to cede the ground in the sense of treating it as a conservative belief. Now, it may be a wrong belief, and Daniel's given all these arguments as to why we don't want to go that route. But where I stand is that one can be an advocate of equality of opportunity, picked as a fundamental value, think egalitarian outcomes are fundamental, and we don't have to cede the ground. That we want to have a vision of merit that is encompassing and respects the complications of people as well as the perspective part. And so I think that's important politically. In other words, that we don't give that one up. And I also think that we, in terms of fighting the debates on this, and ultimately I wrote, the original paper I wrote on this was to claim that affirmative action is meritocratic. And it is traditionally, all these common debate, it's not meritocratic. I think that all that's very wrong. And I wanted to give a language to understand that merit is much more complicated than the conventional definitions. And as I said, I think, is there a distinction without a difference? I think that the importance of the respective meritocracy is, maybe it's not about meritocracy, is that it's something I said before, which is that there's if somebody said to me, what's the most important thing to do to diminish inequality in the United States, I would say reduce segregation. But I mean that in every possible domain. And so I think that the society is organized with some notion of static meritocracy. And so if you accept my dynamic perspective version, that addresses many of the ills that are there. So that's really where I was coming from in all of this.
So I want to come back in a moment to the question of the more radical critique and the question of freedom, because I do think that's a really first order set of things to consider. And in this, before I get there, because I think both of the next two questions I want to get at the question of what's the alternative. So before we get to the more radical, can we have a kind of neo-Marxist critique that's compatible with freedom, and what does it look like? Let me ask the more banal kind of neoliberal version of the question, which is, if I take the equality of opportunity critique as the main critique of meritocracy, kind of a natural thing I might say is, I think, a familiar set of policy ideas which don't dispense with meritocracy, maybe for political economy reasons along the lines Stephen suggests, or maybe because I believe in meritocracy, but which ask what are, on the margin, remedies for the problems you point to, which I think are probably pretty widely accepted, that look like maybe anemic at the moment, but standard policy ideas about investing in early childhood education, about thinking about what are the sources of college admission that are most likely to tap into ability sort of purged of advantage, right, of parental advantage or the like, which I think the evidence suggests is actually things like standardized test scores. That I might think about a bunch of steps which don't look like dispensing with the idea that we should have a system which rewards people for accomplishment and hard work, but rather says, I recognize that the playing field is unlevel, let me level it as best I can, and also let me, in as many steps along the way as possible, look for the sources of information which will speak to people's deep merit as opposed to manifest merit, which represents all. What's wrong with that is that kind of a standard, that's the thing we would tell people at a policy school most of the time.
Right. You want to go ahead?
Well, I don't necessarily think these are incompatible. In other words, I think everything you said I fully agree with. So, so suppose Daniel and I started by saying, here's a set of 15 policies we want to implement. I think they would look very similar. I mean, I don't want to exaggerate that, but there would be great similarities there. But that would all be because the set of policies that we talk about are, in that sense, marginal. The more radical parts of Daniel's book and his worldview is he has much bigger challenges as to how we organize society. And so I don't think, so I'm punting the question in the following sense, which is I think the first question you ask is the approximate improvement question. And so what would you put on the early childhood investment, reversal of the Supreme Court decision on the other end? I could go on these things, right? But all of them don't get to the nexus of a critique of society. And so I'm answering for you. In other words, you would say all of the above.
Yeah, I might say two other things, though, to emphasize that here's a way in which my analysis would lead a person to maybe more radical policies, even within the frame that you're posing. And I think one could get to these policies without my analysis. It's just my analysis will predispose a person to want the more radical policies. So here are two questions about it. One question that the conventional analysis of inequality and stratification confronts is the right way to reduce stratification to lift up the bottom, or is it to push down the top? And there's a strong conventional argument that the right way has got to be to lift up the bottom, and that pushing down the top is not politically palatable and maybe not morally palatable. There's what Derek Parfit called the leveling down objection. How can you be good to produce equality by leveling the top down? Well, one part of the analysis that I gave is that there are huge, you could call these negative externalities because we're in a competitive system, to the extreme investments that rich people make in their children's education. And in a sense, education is like healthcare on this analysis. One thing we've learned is that society is not rich enough to give everyone the health care that very rich people buy for themselves if they're allowed to spend as much as they want. And so every society rations health care at the top. Some do it expressly by limiting the availability of private medicine or private insurance, but even a society like ours does it implicitly by making it be the case that you can't get certain kinds of procedures except in a regulated facility of certain sorts. And so the fact that you have $10 million doesn't enable you to get a kidney transplant tomorrow if you want it. That's rationing at the top, and that's because the society has recognized that equality of outcomes and opportunity requires rationing at the top. And one claim I'm making is that education is like healthcare. So that we cannot allow the rich to buy as much education for their children as they want. We need instead ways of rationing at the top. And we can talk about the freedom point. I think there are ways of doing it that are compatible with the kind of freedom that is worth wanting and having. But I think that's the first point. The second point that leads to a slightly more radical suggestion is the conventional view about stratification very much emphasizes, and here I think we just agree, equality of opportunity holding institutions as constant. So the idea is what we want to do is we want to make it much more, we want to make the opportunity to go to Harvard or to go to Chicago much more equal. And we want to allow Harvard and Chicago to retain their eliteness, but they should just distribute the benefits of their eliteness in a more egalitarian way. And I think both of our views is that that's basically a fool's errand. And that the correct solution instead is to transform the nature of these institutions so that they become less elite and therefore more egalitarian. And very concretely, what does that mean? So it means massively increasing enrollments in these institutions. That's a place at which we agree. And it means changing the nature of the admissions policy. And maybe just as a specific way to illustrate this, I'll contrast. How many people here have heard about Michael Crow, who's the president of the University of Arizona, of Arizona State? So here's how Yale Law School does admissions, and it's probably a little bit like the University of Chicago. We start with a number, 200. We want to enroll 200 students. And ideally, we would like to enroll 200 students while admitting only 200 students. And anybody whom we admit who doesn't come to us, we regard as a failure, because we want to be as elite as we can be, and so we want to minimize the spread of the invitation and get our number. The way Crow does this at Arizona State is he begins with a threshold. He asks, what does someone have to have accomplished as a high school student in order to be university educable? In other words, in order to benefit from a college education. And he then admits everybody who crosses that threshold. And Arizona State is now educating about 140,000 undergraduates as a result. And that's a very different way of producing equality of opportunity. Make the resource as unscarce as you possibly can. And there are all kinds of problems because there are lots of things about elite universities that the intellectuals and scholars in us love that don't exist at Arizona State. And we need to find a way, if we care about that, to preserve that consistent with this social mission. But the social mission is really important, and we're not going to achieve it simply by rearranging the lottery tickets. There have to be a lot more ways in. And I think that's something we just agree about.
Yes.
So,
yeah, go ahead. Sort of follow up. Daniel brought up a very important question, which is about leveling down versus leveling up. And there is a very powerful intuition, moral intuition about leveling up. In what sense, is there a disagreement there? So let me give two examples. Maybe we both agree on them. One claim would be that if I were to double the size of the University of Chicago, that in some sense that's leveling down because the value of the elite degree is diminished. I personally have zero sympathy for anybody who says that that's an invidious form of leveling down, because what it's doing is it's creating more potentials for individuals. In contrast, policies that have been proposed in California to limit the teaching of math in middle schools, I think, are very wrong, because that's leveling down with nothing in terms of it, with some hope that some type of leveling up goes on afterwards. Right. And so I've only put those on the table, not that I'm asking you to agree with them. I'm just saying in my calculus on meritocracy, the first is perfectly justified because I have the set of potentials being maximized is fundamental. The second is not, because that's simply diminishing potentials without affecting
just on this point. So I think I share your intuition about the first. It is leveling down.
Yes.
But it would be a mistake to view it as invidious. But it also would be a mistake to say that it doesn't mean that those who go to Chicago don't lose certain advantages. So let's be honest about that.
Oh, absolutely.
Right?
But I guess in my mind, those are the advantages that
they shouldn't have.
What we call rents, in other words.
let me push back on that a little bit. I'm the dean of a school at the University of Chicago.
And
stand up for elitists.
Can I say
and a Chicago graduate?
Can I just say one more thing about that? But the challenge for the view that both you and I want to articulate here is that the acceptable or appealing version of doubling the enrollment in the University of Chicago very quickly bleeds into the version of California. And so, what are you going to say about the ability of parents to hire tutors for their kids? What are you going to say about teachers in well-resourced universities who, because they're so well-resourced, can put more energy into each student? And it starts looking more like the forms of leveling down that seem less compelling, or maybe some of those are actually okay too, because it turns out they're necessary to produce the first kind. And I am of two minds. I'm deeply ambivalent about some of those policies, for what it's worth.
It seems to me there's an argument to be had here, obviously, about how to achieve equality of opportunity. And there, as you say, there's two mechanisms we have. One is is sort of widening the set of people who come to making elite institutions less elite, let's say. And another is keeping them as elite they are, but doing a better job of finding people who fit Stephen's notion of meritocracy in some sense, the deep ability. It seems to me, at least, that the social theory of an elite research university, and I think this is true of lots of elite institutions, this is true of like an elite medical institution or an elite orchestra or whatever, has to do with something like pure effects, that the distribution of ability in society is kind of has a right tail that's extraordinary, and that those people get out, that there's a deep complementarity between putting extraordinary people in rooms together, that there's outsized social returns to putting the very best scholars with the very best students, and that society reaps tremendous benefits from those along the lines that Rawls would say we ought to be willing to accept the inequality to get the benefits of the very best doctors training the very best doctors and curing cancer at the lake. And there's an empirical question about what the distributions look like and what the production function looks like. There's an on-the-margin question about whether we are currently a little too small relative to even that objective, which we could entertain. But that is different from saying that the University of Chicago or Yale should become, that everyone should aim to be Arizona State.
Yeah. So I really want to say something about that, but it says wrap it up.
Yep.
And, I'm a compliant person.
We're going to take questions.
Right.
So you want to say one word about it, and then we'll open up to questions?
Can I say one? So,
absolutely.
So I want to say 2 words about it. So look, first of all, I think we have to be really careful about which kinds of extraordinary performance we're going to valorize. So, I know law best, and as I say, look, I love my students, I love my job, but much of what I teach my students is a series of techniques that allows large concentrations of capital to prevent the government from taxing them and to extract surplus from labor. And that's I do it very creatively, and my students learn it really well, and that's why they're going to go work at law firms with profits per partner of $8 million a year. And I don't know that that's the kind of thing that we should be valorizing, and there are peer effects there. And it may be even broader. If you go to the medical schools of America, we're really good at some things, and some of those things are incredibly valuable to all of us, like the cure for cancer, but there are also lots of things that we're really bad at. Like, I don't know how many people in this room would want to know, should we be exercising intensely for 2 hours 1 day a week, or for half an hour 4 days a week? Or should we just always take the stairs, and what would be better for our heart health? And if you try to find the answer to that question as a person who wants to stay fit in middle age, you can't answer that question, because our medical establishment has not done the work to answer that question. Why? Because it's a public health question, it's a nurse practitioner question, it's a diet and exercise question, and it's not a question that a single super skilled person can generate an innovation that will allow them to extract a great deal of wealth based on. And so what we've produced is a way of channeling our extraordinary accomplishments in certain directions and not in others. And the fact that they're extraordinary doesn't launder that other fact also. And so that's one, I think, really important point. The other point is, insofar as we really value scholarship and the life of the mind, which I happen to value incredibly highly, much more highly than it's reasonable to expect society to value, the fact that that enterprise has been tied to the de facto social planner for our economy and our society actually makes it harder to have the life of the mind, because we're constantly burdened with the political and economic and social fact that we are advantaging people in non-intellectual ways. And it distorts our intellectual life. And it would be nice if, like, the German Max Planck model turned out to work, where you separate the research and the training of scholars from the rest of the... It turns out it doesn't seem to work very well at generating great scholarship, and that's a problem for the thing I would like. If it were so, I'd say this is what we should do, and we could have everything. But the empirics seem to suggest that we can't.
Can I add a couple of things? You made a slippery slope argument, which I don't agree with. In other words, I don't think the issue is Chicago versus Arizona State, it's Chicago versus Berkeley. And Berkeley has a very large student body. It is producing more Nobel laureates this week than we have one. I think they had 2. But the serious point is, you can have...
Look at you embracing the elitism.
Pardon me?
Look at you embracing the elitism with the Nobel Prizes.
Well, I'm an economist. What can I say? We're very no, but the point is that take that as an institution. It has shown itself great capacity to simultaneously be relatively large, have very high standards for admissions. This was an example that Daniel implied, which is you could say that at a university you could say everybody above a certain threshold is admitted, and if you want everybody randomized, if you need to keep it small, that's one form of that. But the other point that you have to remember is self-organization within the university. Students are going to sort themselves into different classes according to their skills, and so the places where the peer effects may be particularly important are going to be manifested through that process. And so I don't think that there's I don't think a slippery slope argument is what we should be focused on. We should be focused on asking, how do you improve the bottleneck? I gave one example. Here's a second one, which is every elite university could open a prep school, and I'm quite serious about this, which is entirely for people from disadvantaged backgrounds, and provide the training so that the input fulfills their definition of meritocratic admissions. And so it's just to say that to me, the issue isn't meritocracy. The issue is how do you adjust the processes, the mechanisms around it to avoid the distributional instabilities.
All right, we have gone late, but we're going to take some questions, so apologies for, there are microphones, people will come around.
The topic here is the meritocracy trap, but many employers use incorrect gauges of merit, which involve both illegal job discrimination and the refusal to hire college grads to begin the careers we got our educations for. Eventually, all the job discrimination collapses into the black hole of age discrimination. Yet we still have merit. I have merit. Most Americans, being social Darwinists, from the average person to the president, ignore these problems and just blame the victims of involuntary long-term unemployment and involuntary underemployment. What do destitute Americans in these fixes have to do to get hired and paid commensurate with our merit?
Should we take a couple questions and then,
You're
or do you want to, either way, whatever you prefer.
I mean, what I'd say to that directly is just the claim that there's a lot of meritocratic inequality doesn't entail that there is no non-meritocratic inequality. And there's a lot of non-meritocratic inequality remaining in our society, and there are pockets where there's an enormous amount of it, and that's wrong. And now what the policies are to redress it, we have a lot of thoughts about that, and some of them are familiar, some of them are less familiar, but basically, I agree with your basic position that there are people who are being discriminated against in ways that meritocracy would condemn and other principles of equality would also condemn.
Hi, thank you for the talk. This has been discussed as something that is kind of different from the old kind of oligarchy sort of viewpoint, and I was wondering how much that holds given the college admission scandal and the idea that like as much as meritocracy and like investing in human capital results in like students having a lot of ability, there's also just like paying for like cheating, like having the advantage and that happening at multiple levels. And is that like an investment in human capital, or is that just kind of old school kind of cheating in the way that has existed throughout history?
Well, I think all of those are the example you gave of the college admissions and the purchases, that's anti-meritocratic. And so I think that's something that people from all the positions would condemn. But did you have a broader question about the admissions process? The lights are in my eyes. I can't see that's the question.
The microphone has moved, I think.
Yes, but it's coming back.
Yeah, sorry, I guess, yeah, that's what I was trying to get at, is just that some of these investments kind of occur outside of this idea of meritocracy.
Yeah, so I want to distinguish the corruption one, which I think is simply, it's illegal and anti-meritocratic, versus the use of legacy admissions, which, again, the meritocrat would oppose, which would be another example of something which I think I would put in this category. And so my view is, and again, I think the studies by Chetty et al. Have demonstrated that there is very substantial room for improvement of elite schools on their own definitions in terms of who they admit.
I think I want to say two things. We can construct a spectrum. So there's a conceptual question and there's an empirical question. The conceptual question is, how do you go from the obviously anti-meritocratic incorrect to the meritocratic but still incorrect? So the people who bribed coaches to get their kids into college, so that's a corruption of meritocracy. It's also just criminal. Although notice that in the United States, it's criminal only because the universities didn't capture the proceeds of their own corruption. So if somebody's a little bit richer and gives Harvard $10 million for their kid to go to Harvard, that's not illegal. And query whether it should be. So there's that. Then there's alumni preferences, which are also anti-meritocratic. And now you start shading things. So for example, partly because of a commitment to gender equality, all elite universities field large numbers of women's varsity sports teams, and they field them in sports where no public schools have those sports. And so if you want to get into Princeton, to be a woman's lightweight crew rower is incredibly valuable. And you have to accomplish something. You have to be good at lightweight crew rowing. And one of the reasons is that Princeton has an admirable commitment to gender equality inside of it. But it turns out that there are maybe 200 schools that have competitive lightweight crew programs in all of American high schools, as opposed to however many millions have basketball. And so it's rich kids who have that accomplishment and then get in. Now, is that like, then the last point is, if you're rich and you learn a lot, you know, you take linear algebra as a sophomore in high school and you're really good at math. Now, that's meritocratic in a way of getting in. The lightweight crew is a little like that, but it's not quite like that, but it's also not like the legacy admission, and it's certainly not like bribing the coach. And part of the problem here is that we can construct a continuum, and at some point people get off the train and they disagree about where they should. And that's part of the argument that we're having, or discussion we're having collectively.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Zachary. I'm a public policy student here, and my question is for Daniel. And it's centered on how meritocracy intersects with social mobility in the United States in particular. In your presentation, you argued that the new elite are highly capable, unlike their old former aristocrats. And I wanted to know specifically, how do you see this influencing social mobility, especially for future generations, given that you also mentioned that even the elite worker is a victim of exploitation? Right. Sorry if I might have misquoted you.
Yeah, no, good. So I think it's really complicated among different dimensions of social mobility. So I think this causes a huge problem for class mobility, okay? Because the elite in each generation trains its children to accomplish. I think it turns out actually to be pretty good for race and gender mobility. So, for example, a fascinating study published by Kerwin Charles looks at the place of the median non-self-employed, full-time, prime-age black male worker in the white distribution over time, and where the person in the 90th percentile in the black distribution is in the white distribution. And it turns out that in 1970, the person who was in the 90th percentile of the black distribution was below the median of the white distribution. And that's because there were all kinds of non-meritocratic de jure exclusions against people of color, particularly black people, particularly black men, having elite jobs. Today, the person who is in the 90th percentile of the black distribution is at probably the 75th or 80th percentile of the white distribution. So that's because the de jure forms of racial exclusion have fallen away, and one of the reasons for that is meritocracy. That employers and the society has realized that we want to promote talent wherever it is. At the same time as that's happened, the gap between the median black male wage and the median white male wage has increased. And so meritocracy has produced more social mobility based on race at the top of the distribution than would be without meritocracy, and suppressed social mobility and equality at the middle of the distribution. And it's the same mechanism that produces both effects. And that's one of the reasons why this is such an incredibly challenging problem, because one of the reasons we embrace meritocracy is what it did at the top, and one of the reasons why I'm skeptical of meritocracy is what it does at the middle. And it seems like we can't pull these apart very well. I don't know if that's responsive, but that's the way I think about this kind of problem.
Yes, it is responsive, and yes, thank you. That is responsive, and I understand that it's more segregated based off of social hierarchy.
Yeah.
All right, I know there are still remaining questions. I think we are gonna end our formal event, but we are around for a little bit, and if people want to come up and ask questions.
Can I just say thank you?
And so, yeah, thank you all for coming, and thank you both for
That was great.
joining us.